Okay. So thank you very much for coming. And I thought of maybe before we start the reading session, discussion, properly speaking, I thought of maybe presenting my research, which is, as I said before, turning my PhD into a monograph. And somehow the paper I handed out sums up the general argument I developed fully in my PhD. So the title, for the moment, the title of my PhD is Barbara Bodison's Bildung, Education, Feminism and Agency in Epistolary Narratives. And what I do in my research is to discuss the significance of the daily act of reading letters and writing letters, their significance as informal sources of education for literate middle-class women in the context of 19th century England. And what I do so is by focusing on one particular lady and her group of friends, Barbara Bodison, who was a mid-Victorian English feminist, philanthropist and artist. And I also carry out this research through the lenses of an educational concept, which is Bildung. Bildung is a German neo-humanist educational term that refers to the lifelong process of becoming cultured. It seeks the personal growth of individuals in terms of their intellectual growth, but also their moral and physical transformation. And all this as a way towards a better humanity, towards a better society and progress. This neo-humanist educational concept is currently receiving renewed attention, especially in the German-speaking and Nordic countries, wherein the philosophy of education has an ambivalent role, because on the one hand is criticized for its masculinist and classist bias, but at the same time is being reconceptualized as a potential tool to counterbalance, and we might discuss this in a second, counterbalance today's alleged instrumentalist uses of education. And as educationists, maybe we can discuss this point later on. But in any case, it's being used outside the field of history of education, which is mine. So I would like to engage with these debates that are going on and at the moment. And what I do is, from the field of history of education, I read Barbara Bodison's letters through the lens of this educational term, which is problematic, and I will come back to this in a second, but because it helps me to attain my three objectives, which is the first one, to explore informal sources of education for middle-class women at a historical period when bourgeois women received a rather precarious home education. Their schooling insisted on learning the codes of sociability and etiquette. They had limited access to further education, and they were formally excluded from higher education. So within this context, I would like to know the role of letters in acquiring this knowledge they were debarred from. My second objective is to review this historical figure, because she has already been studied, she has been the object of 3 biographies, but scholarship tends to focus on her achievements as a feminist, as an artist, as a philanthropist, and using the theoretical framework of Bildung permits me to highlight problematic aspects of her feminist outlook, especially her ethnocentric and her ethnocentric and classist standpoint. And finally, what I would like to do is to contribute, because I'm working, the primary sources I work with are letters. What I would like to do is to contribute to theorizing epistolary. And what I suggest in my PhD, and I won't have the time to discuss it today, is how I conceptualize letters as sources of historical evidence. So it's somehow engaged in an epistemological debate about historical sources, in this case autobiographical, dialogical historical sources. So in order to read Bodichon's correspondence as Bildung-like educational instruments, what I do is to propose a Foucauldian reading of Bildung, that is a critical reading of Bildung. So what I will do now is to briefly put forward in which how I conceived Bildung from the perspective of Foucault's understanding of power, which is a twofold theoretical term, which is power as productive but at the same time as oppressive, and also by drawing on his notion of resistance. So reading through these different Foucauldian terms, Bildung, in a way that permits me to attain these three objectives. So as I briefly said before, Bildung is a German neo-humanist educational project that refers to the lifelong process of becoming gebildet. Gebildet is cultured in the intellectual, moral, and physical sense of the word. And the process of becoming gebildet, cultured, takes place in interaction with the outer world and interaction with people. The gebildet individual undergoes a process of creative mimesis, in that the individual opens up towards difference. She incorporates this difference into her sense of being, but in a critical fashion. So this process of self-alienation takes place in social relationships when individuals engage with each other's perspectives, because the similarities between individuals create frictions that prompt self-fashioning. And ultimately, Bildung, which is an educational project, requires the gebilded person to put her thoughts into self-determining action, because autonomous action is the cornerstone of Bildung. So, taking on this theoretical framework, my suggestion is that Bodichon's epistolary dialogues, her letters, reflect the essence of Bildung. That is, the intersubjective process of self-development throughout one's life. So it is by means of communicating by letter, which is a daily feminine gesture, so to speak. Through letters, Bodichon not only maintained a reciprocal transformative interaction with them, but she also worked out the Bildung processes of language, knowledge acquisition, self-alienation, creative mimesis, and self-determination. These are somehow the key elements of Bildung: acquiring knowledge, engaging with difference, being critical with difference, and forging your own individuality and transforming this individuality into autonomous action. So my suggestion is that letter writing, an apparently anodyne feminine daily gesture, acted as sources of education in the life of Barbara Bodichon. Education understood in the sense of Bildung, that is, a lifelong process of becoming gebildet, cultured. So as Bildung-like tools, letters acted as forms where she acquired and shared knowledge, she exercised her critical thinking, she forged her identity, and she worked out her autonomy, not only during her schooling years, during her educational years properly speaking, but throughout her life. Notwithstanding, in line with current criticisms of Bildung, and mostly is criticized as a power apparatus in Foucault's sense of the term, my suggestion is that Bodichon's epistolary gebildet self, her epistolary voice, exemplifies the twofold conceptualization of power developed by Foucault as power as oppressive and productive. But her epistolary voice also reflects Foucault's notion of resistance. So, how does it look like? My suggestion is that Bodichon's voice, epistolary voice, is an effect of power in that she forged her individuality within dominant discursive regimes, including gender discourses. But her epistolary voice is also the result of resistance. She challenged some dominant discourses, including discourses on bourgeois femininity. And at the same time, her voice, her epistolary voice, is a footbridge of power, because on occasions she just adopted uncritically dominant oppressive discourses, and she somehow took for granted prejudices against certain social categories. So in order to illustrate this threefold Foucauldian understanding of Bildung, which is somehow my contribution to the debates on Bildung that are taking place at the moment, especially in philosophy of education, what I do is to illustrate the workings of Bildung, epistolary Bildung, with three sets of examples. So what I will do now is briefly comment on these three sets of examples. So the first set, I discussed the dimension, Bildung's dimension of knowledge acquisition, critical thinking, and self-expression. And what I say is that the act of recommending by letter, lending by post, and discussing via epistolary dialogues one single poem by Alfred Tennyson, The Princess, how the act of discussing this poem by letter triggered an epistolary discussion in which Barbara Bodichon and her female friends ended up discussing about women's rights, about women's education, and about marriage. And in these epistolary dialogues, triggered by one single poem, they ended up challenging assumptions, expectations about what women's education should be, what proper femininity should be. The second set of examples discuss a second dimension of Bildung, which is identity formation. And I focus on Barbara Bodichon's travel letters. And again, in her travel letters, mainly written from Spain and Northern Africa, I focus on one particular set of personal correspondence. In these letters, again, she challenges discourses on how a female traveler should behave, but at the same time, she redefines her own understanding as a feminist female traveler, excluding others. So against gendered expectations and without justifying herself for doing so, in her travel letters, she projected herself as an intrepid tourist, and she was traveling on her own or sometimes with a friend only. She projected herself as an intrepid tourist, as an experienced traveler, traveling out of personal curiosity and for the sake of pleasure. And this is an attitude that was marked primarily as masculine inverted commas, but this was somehow the authorial standpoint that male travelers would take at that time. In the same way, regarding herself as an accomplished professional artist, in her travel letters, she entered the male bastion of aesthetics judgment by adopting the inverted commas masculine and authoritative subject position of describing and judging the aesthetic value of cultural sites. I'm talking about art in cultural sites in Spain and Northern Africa. She describes them and she evaluates their value from an omniscient and commanding standpoint. And again, this was an attitude that was mostly found in male travelers, not female travelers. So by doing so, although her epistolary voice was inevitably charged with contemporary understandings about traveling and foreign art, so she was somehow determined by her the cultural discourses of her time, she nonetheless managed to claim her own right, but also women's right to authorize themselves as valid and as recognized cultural reference. Nonetheless, and this is somehow the criticism I I made of Bodichon is that simultaneously, Bodichon's epistolary voice was caught in certain classist and colonialist assumptions she did never put into question. So drawing on the dominant bourgeois discourse of the British economic, political and cultural superiority, in her Spanish letters, for example, Bodichon used her authorial power to justify the appropriation of Spanish artwork on the grounds that the Spaniards were uncultured people, incapable of taking care of their own monuments. So consequently, while she contributed to redefining the category female traveler as an observer capable of expertise, she also contributed to circulating and thus reaffirming a cultural prejudice against backward others. And the final set of examples illustrate the last dimension of autonomy I discussed, dimension of Bildung I discussed, autonomy. Autonomy understood here in the sense of Diana Mayer's description of the term, which is one's capacity to act in harmony with our evolving self. So autonomy understood not that much in the Kantian sense of the word, but according to this feminist reading of autonomy, as one's capacity to act in accordance with one's evolving self throughout one's life. So my suggestion is that the letters I quote show that they functioned as forums where Bodichon projected an articulation of her working out her autonomy. In this case, and I focus on one particular dimension of her life, devoting her life in social reform. Her teenage letters show how she underwent, in dialogue with her epistolary addressees, the processes of, and I'm using Diana Mayer's conceptual vocabulary, she undergoes the processes of self-discovery, self-definition, and self-direction, which are all part of working out your autonomy. This self-discovery is to know what one is like. Self-definition is to establish one's own standards and to modify one's qualities to meet them. And self-direction is to express one's personality in action. So my suggestion is that let us show how Barbara Bodichon, disregarding prescriptive notions of ladylike idleness and femininity, she experienced the processes of devising a life plan and in the end living a self-fulfilling life, which is somehow the key word in Mayer's understanding of autonomy, self-fulfillment. However, in Bodichon's claim, in her claim to self-fulfillment as a future philanthropist, Bodichon foreclosed the capacity for autonomy on others, for taking for granted middle-class superiority vis-a-vis the lower ranks. The subject positions she constructed in her teenage letters draw on the patronizing discourse of the well-intended and apparently altruistic humble aid towards the hapless, destitute, but unfortunately this discourse is underpinned by an exclusionary standpoint and turns her claim to her own right to self-fulfillment into a privilege granted to some people only. And so to conclude, Bodichon's letter suggests that she did manage to work out a female articulation of Bildung, and that she subverted to a certain extent Bodichon Bildung's masculinist underpinnings. In this sense, reading Bodichon's personal correspondence through the lens of Bildung permits calling attention to the educational dimension of the daily act of letter writing. So parallel to their communication, their obvious communication power, epistolary dialogues function as productive sites for the acquisition of knowledge, the exercise of critical thinking, the forging of her identity, and working out her autonomy. However, Bodichon's letters also suggest that she developed Bildung at the expense of certain social categories. Bildung's requirement to encounter the unknown did not always lead her to a critical self-assessment and to be open, to have an open attitude towards different. Quite the contrary, her claim for the right to personal development against gendered expectations, which she managed to do, often implied a discriminatory redefinition of her own outlook. So ultimately, this critical understanding of Bildung, using Foucault and Mayer's theoretical projects, permits unpacking Baudission's bourgeois and rather ethnocentric standpoint, which are aspects of her feminism that overall scholarship tends to overlook. Thank you very much.